The call came in at 4:47 in the morning. Not the witching hour, not the dead of night, just that gray space before dawn when the city's still deciding whether to wake up or stay under. Dispatch said it clean, body in a bathtub, residential address in Heights, caller anonymous. The address meant money. Old money, the kind that doesn't show off but knows every judge by their first name. I'd been on homicide for 16 years at that point, and I knew what an anonymous call to that neighborhood usually meant. Someone saw something they weren't supposed to see and they wanted to stay invisible. When we arrived, the house was lit up like a theater. Every window glowing, front door open, not a soul in sight. My partner looked at me with that expression he got when something smelled wrong from the start. We found her in the master bathroom upstairs. Cassandra, 41, formerly Cassandra Vane before her marriage 6 years prior. She was wearing a white silk nightgown that had turned translucent in the water, and her left hand hung over the edge of the tub, fingers slightly curled like she'd been reaching for something. The water was cold, clear, no blood, no foam, no signs of struggle. Her eyes were open, staring up at the recessed lighting. I've seen drownings before, they don't look peaceful. But this one did, almost deliberately so. The medical examiner would later confirm what I already suspected. She'd been dead for at least 8 hours before we got that call. Which raised the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. Who was in that house all night with her body, and why did they wait until morning to make the call? The bathroom itself told a story that didn't match the scene. Expensive Italian tile, a freestanding tub that probably cost more than my car, candles arranged on the windowsill all unlit. The towels were folded, unused. No wine glass, no book, nothing to suggest she'd been planning a relaxing bath. Women like Cassandra didn't just climb into a tub in the middle of the night without reason. The medicine cabinet was closed, and when we opened it, everything was arranged with obsessive precision. Prescription bottles lined up by height, labels facing forward. Xanax, the usual cocktail for someone who couldn't sleep and couldn't stop thinking. But the bottles were all nearly full, refill dates recent. If she was taking them, she wasn't taking them regularly. On the counter, her phone sat face down, battery dead. Knowing the real story, was probably locked inside, protected by passwords and deleted messages. Noticed it first, the small bruise on her right shoulder, barely visible under the strap of her nightgown. Recent, maybe a day or two old, thumb-sized, the kind you get when someone grabs you hard enough to leave a mark but not hard enough to make you scream. The water had wrinkled her skin, but the bruise stood out, darker than it should have been. I made a note. The house smelled wrong too, not like death, not yet, just like absence. No coffee brewing, no leftover dinner smells, nothing alive. It was a house where people existed but didn't live. And somewhere in all that expensive silence, someone had decided that Cassandra didn't need to exist anymore. Her husband found her. That's what he told the first responding officers, and that's what he told us when we sat him down in the kitchen 2 hours later. Gregory, 47, senior partner at a corporate law firm downtown, the kind of man whose suit costs more than a month's rent and who knows it. He was calm. Too calm for someone who just discovered his wife dead in their bathtub. He sat with his hands folded on the marble kitchen island, and he walked us through it with the precision of a closing argument. He'd been in Chicago for work, flew back early that morning, came home around 4:15, went upstairs, found her. Called 911 immediately. Hadn't touched anything, hadn't moved her. We asked why he came home early. Business wrapped up faster than expected, he said. We asked if she'd seemed upset recently, depressed, unstable. He paused for exactly 3 seconds before answering. She'd been under stress, he said, personal matters. He didn't elaborate. When I asked what kind of personal matters, he looked at me with the flat, evaluating stare of someone who'd spent his career deciding what information to give and what to withhold. Then he said, I think she was having an affair. He said it the way you'd report a fender bender. No anger, no grief, just a statement of fact. Asked him if he knew who. He shook his head, said he had suspicions but no proof, hadn't confronted her, didn't want to deal with the mess until after a major case he was working settled. We asked if he still loved her. He said, I married her, which wasn't an answer, and that's when I noticed his hands, no ring. He saw me looking and said he'd taken it off on the plane, habit when he traveled. But his ring finger had no tan line, no indentation. It hadn't seen a ring in months, maybe longer. The initial theory was obvious, almost insultingly so. Depressed wife, distant husband, possible affair, bottles of pills within arm's reach. Suicide had a clean, tragic logic to it. The department liked clean. The chief liked closed cases, and Gregory liked the idea of his wife's death being a private tragedy rather than a public scandal. The autopsy was scheduled for the following morning, and everyone seemed content to wait for the toxicology report that would confirm what we already believed. But I couldn't stop thinking about that anonymous call. If Gregory found her at 4:15 and called 911 immediately, the timeline worked. But dispatch logged the anonymous call at 4:47, 32 minutes later. I pulled the recordings. The anonymous caller was male, spoke in a whisper, gave the address, said there was a body hung up. No panic, no emotion, just information. Gregory's 911 call came through the regular line at 4:51, 4 minutes after the anonymous tip. He sounded shaken on that call, breathing hard, asking for police and an ambulance, giving his name and relationship to the victim. 2 different calls, 2 different tones, 4 minutes apart. I asked Gregory about it when we brought him in for a follow-up. He said he had no idea about any other call, must have been a neighbor who saw the lights, maybe heard something. But Heights wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people looked in windows or called in tips. It was the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and expected everyone else to do the same. Thought I was chasing smoke. Said sometimes coincidences were just coincidences, and we had bigger things to worry about, like finding out who she was sleeping with and whether he had a reason to want her dead. But I'd been doing this long enough to know that coincidences were just patterns you hadn't figured out yet. The detail that broke everything came from the medical examiner, and it wasn't what anyone expected. Cassandra didn't drown. There was no water in her lungs. None. She was dead before she went into that tub, and she'd been dead for at least 2 hours before her body touched the water. Cause of death: asphyxiation, likely from a plastic bag or something similar held over her face until she stopped breathing. No ligature marks on her neck, no signs of manual strangulation, just the quiet, methodical suffocation of someone who couldn't fight back. The in her system explained why. She'd taken at least 3 pills, probably more within an hour of her death. Not enough to kill her, but enough to make her slow, compliant, easy to control. Someone had drugged her, waited for her to become helpless, then killed her. Then they'd moved her body to the bathtub, arranged her carefully, and staged the scene to look like a tragic accident or a peaceful suicide. The bruise on her shoulder made sense now. Someone had held her down or dragged her or positioned her. The crime scene wasn't a crime scene at all, it was theater. And the person who'd staged it had done it well enough that we'd almost bought it. Almost. When we told Gregory, he didn't react the way innocent people react. He didn't rage, didn't break down, didn't demand to know who would do this. He sat very still, looked at his hands and said, "So it wasn't an accident." Not a question, a confirmation, like some part of him had already known. We asked him where he was the night before the real timeline. He adjusted his story, said he'd actually flown in around midnight, not 4 in the morning. Got home around 1, found Cassandra asleep, didn't want to wake her, slept in the guest room. Didn't check on her until morning, completely different from his first statement. When I pointed that out, he said he'd been in shock, confused, didn't remember the details clearly. But Gregory didn't forget details. That was his entire profession. The investigation should have intensified then. Homicide instead of suicide meant more resources, more pressure, more urgency. But that's not what happened. Instead, things slowed down. Calls from the chief's office, questions about whether we were being too aggressive with Gregory, reminders that he was a respected member of the community with powerful friends. His law firm hired a criminal defense attorney before we even named him a person of interest. We brought him in for formal questioning 3 times, and each time his lawyer shut down anything substantive. Gregory stuck to his revised story, came home late, slept separately, found her in the morning, panicked, and called 911. He had no idea who would want to hurt her. No idea about any enemies, any threats, any problems beyond the possible affair he'd mentioned. When we pushed on the affair, he suddenly became vague. Said maybe he'd been mistaken, maybe he'd misread things, didn't want to damage her reputation now that she was gone. It was in saying nothing while appearing cooperative. Meanwhile, started running down her life, looking for anyone who might have wanted her dead. Cassandra had been a psychiatric social worker before her marriage, worked with troubled teens and trauma survivors. She'd quit after marrying Gregory, became a full-time philanthropist, sat on boards, organized fundraisers, did all the things wealthy wives do when they need to feel useful. On paper, her life was spotless, but paper lies. We found her personal laptop hidden in her closet, tucked inside a designer handbag she clearly never used. It took our tech guys 2 days to crack it, and what they found didn't match the image of the devoted wife and charitable socialite. She'd been documenting something, keeping detailed notes about money, dates, transactions, and she'd been terrified. The witnesses we interviewed gave us a version of Cassandra that didn't match the crime scene or the grieving widow act Gregory was performing for the press. Her best friend said Cassandra had been planning to leave her husband. Not someday, not eventually, soon. She'd asked for the name of a divorce attorney 3 weeks before she died. Said she needed someone aggressive, someone who wouldn't back down from a fight. Asked her why, what had happened. Cassandra said she'd found something out, something Gregory had been hiding, and she couldn't live with it anymore. But she didn't say what. She made promise not to tell anyone, said it was dangerous, said she needed to be careful, gave her the attorney's name. Cassandra never called. The attorney confirmed that Cassandra had reached out by email asking for a consultation. They'd scheduled a meeting for 2 days after she died. The email was still in his inbox, polite and formal, asking about his experience with high-net-worth divorces and whether consultations were confidential. She'd used a burner email address, not her regular one, someone who didn't want her husband to find out she was talking to lawyers. We interviewed Cassandra's hairstylist, her yoga instructor, the woman who ran the charity foundation where she volunteered. Same pattern. Everyone said she'd seemed different in the last month. Distracted, worried, not herself. But when we asked if she'd mentioned anything specific, they all said no. She'd kept it locked down, whatever it was. The only person who pushed back on that narrative was Gregory's business partner, a man named Colin, who said Cassandra had always been unstable, emotionally fragile, prone to paranoia. Said she'd accused Gregory of all kinds of things over the years, none of it true, and it had put a strain on the marriage. When I asked him what kinds of things, he smiled and said, "The kind you don't repeat if you respect the dead." It felt like a warning. The timeline didn't work, no matter how we tried to make it fit. Gregory said he arrived home around 1 in the morning, but his flight didn't land until 11:40, and it was a 40-minute drive from the airport to Heights in good traffic. Security footage from the airport parking garage showed his car leaving at 12:03 a.m. He should have been home by 12:45 at the latest. But a neighbor, Harold, told us he'd seen headlights in the driveway closer to 2 in the morning. He remembered because his dog had barked, woke him up, and he'd looked out the window. Was 82 and sharp as glass, the kind of man who noticed everything and forgot nothing. We asked if he was sure about the time. He said he'd checked his watch, old habit from his years as an engineer, 2:10, maybe 2:15. That gave Gregory an extra hour and a half unaccounted for. When we confronted him, he said was mistaken. Old people lose track of time, and besides, what did it matter? He came home, his wife was already dead. The timeline didn't change that. Except the medical examiner said Cassandra died sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning. If Gregory got home at 12:45, she could have still been alive. If he got home at 2:15, she was already cold. The difference mattered. It mattered a lot. We pulled his phone records. He'd made one call that night at 1:34 a.m. to a number registered to a man named David, Gregory's younger brother. The call lasted 9 minutes. We asked Gregory about it. He said David had been having personal problems and he'd called to check in, just a brotherly conversation, nothing to do with Cassandra. We asked if we could talk to David. Gregory said he was traveling out of the country, unreachable. We asked where. Gregory said he wasn't sure, somewhere in Europe maybe. His lawyer stepped in then, said the call was irrelevant and we were harassing his client. But 9 minutes is a long time to check in on someone having personal problems at 1:30 in the morning. David was not in Europe. He was in a motel 6 miles from his brother's house, registered under a fake name, paying cash. We found him because Gut said to check local motels, and Gut was rarely wrong. David was 39, divorced, unemployed, and bitter about all of it. He had a record, nothing violent, just a DUI and some unpaid child support, the kind of mess that follows you around and makes sure you never quite get your life together. He didn't want to talk to us at first, said he didn't know anything, hadn't seen Cassandra in months. Then we told him his brother had mentioned a phone call and his face changed. He said okay, yes, Gregory had called him that night, said he needed help with something, said it was urgent. David had driven to the house, got there around 1:45, left around 2:30. When we asked what kind of help, David went quiet, said he didn't want to get his brother in trouble. We told him his brother was already in trouble, and he could either tell us the truth now or tell it to a jury later. He asked for immunity. We said we'd talk to the DA. 2 days later, David sat across from us in an interview room and told us what had really happened that night. Gregory had called him, panicked, said Cassandra was dead, said he'd come home and found her in the bedroom, not breathing. David rushed over. Cassandra was on the bed, already cold, clearly gone. There were pill bottles on the nightstand, and Gregory kept saying it looked like she'd overdosed, maybe on purpose, maybe by accident. David asked if he'd called 911. Gregory said no, said he needed to think, needed to figure out what to do. He didn't want a scandal, didn't want it to look like he'd failed her. They argued. David said they had to call the police, there was no other option. Gregory said he'd call them, he just needed a few hours to get his head straight. He asked David to help him move her to the bathroom, make it look like an accident, a drowning, something less shameful than pills. David said no. Gregory begged. David finally agreed, told himself he was helping his brother, protecting the family. They moved her together, filled the tub, arranged her body, wiped down everything they'd touched. Then David left and Gregory waited until morning to call. David swore that's all he did. He didn't kill her. Gregory didn't kill her. She was already dead when he got there. But the way he said it, you could tell he didn't fully believe it himself. The psychology of Gregory was a textbook case in control. Everything about him was measured, calculated, designed to project competence and authority. Men like him don't lose their tempers. They don't make impulsive decisions. They think 3 moves ahead and they always have an exit strategy. But murder isn't a negotiation. It's not a contract you can draft and redraft until the language is perfect. It's messy and final, and it leaves traces. If Gregory killed his wife, he'd have planned it carefully. He'd have made sure there was no physical evidence tying him to the act. He'd have built reasonable doubt into every corner of the crime. And he'd have convinced himself, somewhere in that cold lawyer brain of his, that he had no other choice. We brought in a forensic psychologist to build a profile. She said Gregory fit the pattern of a narcissistic personality with sociopathic tendencies, someone who views other people as obstacles or tools, not as fully human, someone for whom empathy is a performance, not a feeling. She said if he did it, the motive wouldn't be rage or jealousy, it would be practical. Cassandra had become a problem and he'd solved her. The problem was proving it. Everything we had was circumstantial. The stage scene, the inconsistent timeline, the phone call to David, it all pointed to consciousness of guilt, but not necessarily guilt of murder. A good defense attorney could argue that Gregory had panicked upon finding his wife dead and made a terrible decision to cover it up, but that didn't make him a killer. And that's exactly what his attorney argued loudly in every conversation with the DA's office. Meanwhile, Gregory did interviews. Sat down with local news, talked about his grief, about how much he loved Cassandra, about the epidemic of mental health struggles among women. He set up a foundation in her name to fund depression research. The press ate it up. He became the sympathetic widower, the man trying to turn tragedy into something meaningful. And the more he controlled the narrative, the harder it became to charge him with anything. The mistake that cost someone their life didn't happen the night Cassandra died. It happened 3 weeks earlier, and we didn't find out about it until we started digging into her digital trail. The laptop we'd found in her closet contained a folder labeled backup. Inside were scanned documents, bank statements, wire transfer receipts, emails, all related to Gregory's law firm and its clients. She'd been collecting evidence. Evidence of what exactly took us days to piece together, because the documents were dense and technical, full of legal jargon and financial structures designed to obscure rather than clarify. But the pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Gregory's firm represented several pharmaceutical companies, mid-tier manufacturers that supplied opioids to distributors across the Midwest. One of those companies, Prescott Medical Solutions, had been hit with multiple lawsuits alleging they'd knowingly shipped pills to clinics that were running illegal prescription mills. The lawsuits were going nowhere. Gregory had made sure of that. He'd buried the plaintiffs in motions, dragged out discovery, settled the cases that couldn't be won for pennies on the dollar, and made the whole problem disappear quietly. But Cassandra had found something else. She'd found emails between Gregory and Prescott's CEO discussing how to hide shipment records, how to create plausible deniability, how to structure payments to avoid triggering federal audits. It wasn't just defense work, it was conspiracy. And if those emails became public, Gregory wouldn't just lose his law license. He'd go to prison. Cassandra had been planning to turn the documents over to federal prosecutors. She'd contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office anonymously 3 weeks before her death, asking how to safely report corporate misconduct. They'd told her to come in with counsel. She never made it. The mistake was telling anyone. The mistake was believing she could threaten a man like Gregory and walk away. The evidence that disappeared was the original laptop. The one we found in Cassandra's closet was a backup, a secondary device she'd used to store copies of the documents. But her primary laptop, the one she used every day, was missing. Gregory said she'd probably taken it somewhere, maybe left it in her car, maybe lost it. We searched the house, the car, her gym locker, every place she'd been in the weeks before her death. Nothing. We got a warrant for the firm's offices, searched Gregory's desk, his files, his computer. Nothing. The tech team said it was possible she'd uploaded everything to a cloud service, but her accounts came up empty. Either she deleted everything or someone else had. The emails Cassandra had collected were damning, but without the original laptop, a defense attorney could argue they were fabricated, taken out of context, or obtained illegally. The federal prosecutors were interested but cautious. They wanted the original device, wanted to verify chain of custody, wanted to be absolutely sure the evidence would hold up in court. Without it, they weren't willing to move forward. And without federal charges, we couldn't leverage the corporate conspiracy to build a murder case. It was a perfect circle of legal protection. Gregory had practiced law long enough to know exactly which threads to pull to unravel an investigation. We interviewed his IT guy at the firm, a kid named who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He said Gregory had asked him to run a data wipe on an old office laptop about 3 weeks ago, said he was donating it to charity and wanted to make sure there was nothing sensitive on it. Had used military-grade deletion software, the kind that overwrites the drive multiple times until recovery is impossible. He said he didn't think anything of it at the time. It was a routine request. But when we asked him to describe the laptop, it matched the brand and model Cassandra had used. Said he didn't ask questions, he just did what he was told. The pressure didn't come from the evidence, it came from everywhere else. Phone calls from the mayor's office asking why we were harassing a prominent attorney. Op-eds in the local paper questioning whether the police were pursuing a vendetta. Gregory's law firm hired a PR agency that started seeding stories about Cassandra's mental health, about her history of depression, about her prescription drug use. None of it was false exactly, but it painted a picture of a woman who was unstable, unreliable, possibly suicidal. The narrative shifted from who killed Cassandra to did Cassandra kill herself, and is the police investigation just a tragic mistake? The chief called me into his office and told me to be careful. Said he trusted my instincts but that we couldn't afford to be wrong on this one. Said if we were going to charge Gregory, we needed it airtight, no room for doubt. He didn't say back off. He didn't have to, and I kept working the case, but we could feel the walls closing in. Witnesses started changing their stories, saying they'd been mistaken, saying they didn't want to be involved. Cassandra's best friend called me 2 weeks into the investigation and said she'd misunderstood what Cassandra had told her about leaving Gregory. Said maybe Cassandra had just been venting, the way friends do, and she didn't want to cause problems for the family. When I reminded her that she'd been very specific in her first statement, she said she'd been emotional, not thinking clearly. The hairstylist stopped returning our calls. The yoga instructor said she didn't remember Cassandra seeming worried, just tired. One by one, the people who'd painted a picture of a woman in fear backed away from their own words. And Harold, the neighbor who'd seen headlights at 2 in the morning, he recanted. Said he'd gotten the time wrong, mixed up the nights, wasn't sure anymore. Said he didn't want any trouble. The alternative version of events was simple, and it made a terrible kind of sense. Cassandra discovered that her husband was complicit in corporate crimes that had contributed to the opioid epidemic. She collected evidence, planned to turn him in, maybe even planned to divorce him and testify against him. Gregory found out. Maybe he saw the documents, maybe he guessed what she was doing, maybe she confronted him directly. He couldn't let her go through with it. His career, his reputation, his freedom, everything depended on her silence. So he made sure she stayed silent. He crushed up enough to make her compliant, probably mixed it into something she ate or drank that evening. He waited until she was sedated, then he suffocated her. It would have been quick, she wouldn't have been able to fight. Then he called his brother, panicked not because he'd just found his wife dead, but because he'd just killed her and needed help staging the scene. David helped move the body, believing Gregory's story about finding her already gone. Then Gregory waited, let a few hours pass, and called 911 with a performance of shock and grief. The anonymous call we'd received earlier, probably Gregory himself, calling from a burner phone to establish a timeline that put him in the clear, making it look like someone else had discovered the body first. He miscalculated by 4 minutes, but 4 minutes wasn't enough to prove anything. It was a good plan, it almost worked. The only thing he couldn't control was Cassandra's backup laptop, the one she'd hidden so carefully that he never found it, and even that didn't matter in the end because we couldn't tie him to her death conclusively enough to charge him. The DA reviewed everything we had and said it wasn't enough. Circumstantial evidence, cooperative behavior, no forensics placing him at the scene during the time of death. A defense attorney would tear it apart. We needed more. So we never got more. The motive wasn't love or jealousy, it was survival. Gregory had built a life on a foundation of respectability and success, and Cassandra threatened to collapse it. In his mind, she'd become the enemy, not because she'd betrayed him personally, but because she'd decided that truth mattered more than loyalty. Men like Gregory don't understand that kind of thinking. To them, loyalty is everything. You protect the family, the firm, the image. You don't burn it down because you've developed a conscience. Cassandra's conscience made her dangerous, and dangerous people don't get warnings, they get eliminated. The emails she'd collected proved that Gregory had helped pharmaceutical companies evade accountability for shipping opioids into communities that were already drowning in addiction. He'd taken their money, protected their interests, and wrapped it all in the language of zealous advocacy and attorney-client privilege. When Cassandra found out, she didn't confront him with anger. She confronted him with evidence and a plan. That's what scared him, not her emotions, but her clarity. She knew what she was going to do, and she was going to do it no matter what he said. So he did what he'd been trained to do his entire career. He solved the problem. He removed the obstacle. He protected the client himself. And he did it with the same cold calculation he brought to every case, every negotiation, every situation where he needed to win. Murder wasn't a crime of passion for Gregory. It was a strategic decision. And if it made him a monster, he'd convinced himself it was a necessary kind of monster. The truth was dangerous because it connected too many dots. Prescott Medical Solutions was just one client. Gregory's firm represented dozens of corporations with regulatory problems, legal exposure, secrets they needed buried. If Cassandra's documents had gone public, if federal investigators had started pulling threads, the entire firm could have collapsed. Partners would have been disbarred. Clients would have faced criminal charges. Millions of dollars in settlements and fines would have followed. Gregory wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting an entire ecosystem of money and power that depended on people like him to make problems disappear. And the scariest part, he wasn't special. There were lawyers like him in every major city working for firms just like his doing the same kind of work, making sure the people who caused harm never faced consequences, keeping the machinery running smoothly. Cassandra's death wasn't an anomaly, it was a function of the system. She threatened the system, and the system protected itself. The fact that it happened in a bathtub in a nice house in a good neighborhood with expensive lawyers and polite press statements didn't make it any less brutal. It just made it easier to ignore. The federal prosecutors eventually opened an investigation into Prescott Medical Solutions, but it moved slowly and quietly, and most of the key documents had been destroyed or sealed under attorney-client privilege. A few low-level employees took plea deals. The CEO retired with a golden parachute. Gregory's firm issued a statement saying they'd had no knowledge of any wrongdoing and had fully cooperated with authorities. No charges were filed against the firm or any of its partners. The system had done what it was designed to do. It had protected its own. The consequences of the crime extended far beyond Cassandra's death. Her family, her parents, her sister never got closure. They believed the official story at first, the one about depression and pills and a tragic accident. Then they started hearing rumors, reading between the lines of news articles, asking questions we couldn't answer. They hired a private investigator who found the same dead ends we did. Eventually, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Gregory, but it was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount and a non-disclosure agreement. They took the money and disappeared from public view, silent and broken. Stopped talking to reporters after someone slashed her tires and left a note on her windshield that said, "Mind your business." She moved to another state 6 months later. David, the brother who'd helped stage the scene, was never charged with anything. He gave us what we needed for immunity, but his cooperation didn't lead to an arrest, so technically the deal was void. Still, we didn't go after him. He wasn't the killer. He was just a man who'd made a terrible choice to protect his brother and had to live with it. Last I heard, he'd started drinking again, lost his visitation rights with his kids, ended up in a halfway house somewhere in Ohio. Gregory continued practicing law. His firm lost a few clients in the aftermath, but most stayed. He kept a lower profile, stopped doing interviews, let the story fade. 2 years later, he, a younger woman who worked in marketing and didn't ask questions. They sold the house in Heights and bought a place in a gated community with better security. He never went to prison. He never even went to trial. And somewhere in all of that, justice stopped meaning anything at all. What never entered the official report was everything that mattered. The fear we saw in witnesses' eyes when they recanted their statements. The sudden promotions and consulting contracts that a few key people received from firms connected to Gregory's network. The way evidence requests got delayed, how warrants took weeks to process, how every step forward met resistance from people who should have been helping. There was no conspiracy, nothing you could point to and say this is corruption. It was subtler than that. It was the way power protects itself without ever acknowledging it's doing so. Phone calls between people who play golf together. Favors exchanged between law school classmates. A judge who owed someone a favor deciding to exclude a piece of evidence on a technicality. Small decisions that added up to a system that valued order over truth. The report said Cassandra died of asphyxiation in a manner that could not be conclusively determined. It listed Gregory as a person of interest but noted insufficient evidence for charges. It mentioned the staged scene, the inconsistencies, the missing laptop. But it didn't say what we all knew, that a woman had been murdered for threatening powerful interests, and those interests had closed ranks to make sure no one paid for it. The case remained open, technically. In reality, it was buried, retired a year later, took his pension and moved to Florida. Said he couldn't do it anymore, couldn't keep pretending that any of it mattered. I stayed on for another decade, worked other cases, solved most of them. But I never stopped thinking about Cassandra. About the way she'd looked in that bathtub, arranged so carefully, like someone's idea of peace. About the fact that her murder was perfect not because it was clever, but because the people who should have cared chose not to. The quiet came after everything else had burned through. No arrests, no trial, no moment of justice where someone stood in a courtroom and heard the word guilty. Just paperwork and closed doors and the slow, suffocating realization that some cases don't get solved because they're not meant to be solved. I left homicide eventually, transferred to cold cases, then took early retirement when my hands started shaking too much to hold a pen steady. I wrote about Cassandra's case in a journal I kept locked in my desk, pages and pages of details that never made it into any official file. I wrote about the corruption I couldn't prove, and the witnesses who disappeared, and the brother who helped stage his sister-in-law's death because blood is thicker than morality. I wrote about Gregory, who sits somewhere right now in his expensive house with his expensive wife, and who has convinced himself that he didn't murder anyone, that he simply managed a difficult situation with the same pragmatism he brought to every case. I wrote about a system that values reputation over lives and silence over truth. And I wrote about the one thing I couldn't shake, the detail that kept me awake more nights than I can count. When we searched the house that first morning, when everything still felt like an accident, I found something in the kitchen trash. A plastic bag, the kind you get from a grocery store, stuffed down under coffee grounds and newspapers. It had condensation inside and there were faint marks on the plastic, lip marks, the kind left by someone pressing their mouth against it, trying to breathe. We had as evidence, sent it to the lab. The report came back weeks later. No viable DNA, no fingerprints, just residual moisture and those faint impressions. Could have come from anywhere, the tech said. Could have been in that trash for days, but I knew it was the murder weapon. And Gregory had thrown it away in his own kitchen, confident that no one would look, that no one would care, that he was untouchable. He was right.